Thank you. I have 30 minutes. I started late. I will go on late. I told Warren not to worry his pretty little head, that I will cut into his time, and he said life is tough. Okay, thank you, Doug Rante, for introducing me and mentioning the guru title. The correct spelling with guru, and I have to tell it to Doug, because Peter Drucker said about somebody else, they call him guru because they don't know how to spell charlatan. So this is how you spell charlatan. It was too long to fit on my business card, so I decided to go with guru. What I want to talk about are various topics. One, last year I was right. Doesn't happen often. I think for the next 20 years I will start reminding everybody that I was right. So we'll talk about the bet. Production levels, I do believe we're in a bubble environment. I will have a wimpy type forecast, more correctly, about oil prices, and then assorted topics. So starting with the bet, if those of you who were last time here may remember that exactly a year ago I had a chart, I had analysis, and I said I believe Boeing will re-engine this year, meaning 2011. And I told people that I had a bet with Brother Doug Rante, who was, like this year, chairman of the meeting, and that we bet for a bottle of wine. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that Jim Albo, president of Boeing, spoke afterwards and decided to join in this bet. And that's kind of interesting because we were betting on what he will do. And I knew better what he will do. Now, it's not true that we are married. I know those who are married have similar things where I know better what you think, but turns out that actually I knew better. So being a peasant, I said to Jim, you know what, since you lost, I'm not a great connoisseur of wine. How about models? And he kind of looked at me and I said, no, not these kind of models. This is at the Paris Air Show, Bombardier kind of misunderstood it also. There was the person ahead of me was Nico Buchholz from Lufthansa. He fits in there much better, being slightly taller. And notice that I'm holding glass of champagne, and people said, let me hold it for you. I said, no, I want my wife to see where my hands are. Okay, so not even this kind of a model. This is a model of a 330 that Airbus gave me that is 16.5 pounds of pure chocolate. And being a chocoholic and models, you know, that looked like the perfect thing. So we actually invited some of our Airbus friends, and we had a party. This is in our boardroom. And Rickard de Jong, our outstanding engineer, parted out of the plane. So you can see I'm holding a piece of pizza, so it was a balanced meal, pizza and chocolate. So these are kind of the models, and this is an airline that no longer exists, Air Polonia, and ILFC was very kind to give it to me, and on the other side, it actually says Air Pilarski. Very kind of them. Here is the model that Jim Albo sent me. It's not a MAX. At that time they didn't have it yet. but it's Adam, I always settle my bets, Jim Alba. To show his class, he then said, you know what, if you are ever in Seattle, I will also give you a bottle of wine. So turns out I was in Seattle with family, so here's ISTAT and Son of Satan, and we exchanged bottles of wine. Now, here was a party that I threw for Avitas folks, and we had this bottle of wine, and showing through class, this was an outstanding wine, and the one that he got was actually ISTAT's wine that my daughter made with me. So it's not exactly the same. Gabi's awesome tiger wine. Okay, and then Jim again showing through class said it was the best bet I ever lost. Now, what do forecasters do? In general, we are smarter than to do short-term forecasts. So we do long-term forecasts. And short-term is very bad because you know that next year you will come here and people will still remember. Correct? So the typical forecasts are there will be a demand for 33,248 aircraft for the next 20 years. And they will be worth 4,128,600,000, you know, down to 78 cents. Because we know that in 20 years nobody will remember it, you guys will be retired, you will have other jobs. Forecasters may actually even have another job. So the precise forecasts are very seldom where somebody says it will happen this year. The Mayans did it, but they did it a long time ago. But clearly we know it will end actually in the afternoon. To be more specific, 3:48 p.m. So, recommendation, get your Christmas presents early. Here is a very well-known journalist, Dominic Gates, who interviewed Steve Hazy. And Steve said correctly, the analysts own the guys who buy the airplane. I'm the guy who has to buy the airplane and live with these decisions. And yes, forecasters do analysis. Steve, if he wanted to live more modestly than he does today, he would have been an analyst. He would have been a brilliant analyst. Instead, he decided to make a few $1 billion because he actually takes action. The same way economists knew that, for example, the British pound was overvalued. Mr. Soros made a few $1 billion of it because he was willing to take the chance and come up with the exact date. We forecasters just know that we can do analysis. So how did my forecast happen? I showed last year my analysis, and I convinced myself, that's why I went for the bet. But also using some American sayings, even a blind squirrel finds a nut sometime. Broken clock is correct twice a day. I'd rather be lucky than good. And finally, thank you, Boeing. They are nice to me and decided to raise my ego, boost my ego, and be nice. Thank you, Joe. And Joe got a nice promotion out of it. So see, I planted it in Jim's mind, and should I say you owe me? Okay. Models. Switching now to production levels. Again, it's something I've been preaching for some time, and I really believe it. But let's start with where are we this year? There is a chance, I don't think a high chance, but there is a chance of another one of those perfect storms. Bad things that might happen all of a sudden and all together. We can have an Iran flare-up, which would cause oil prices to go through the roof. Europe is in, at least Western Europe is definitely in a recession. We have a lot of beginning of problems in China, which includes not just economic slowdown, there's some political infighting. Boigo's son was just deposed from being mayor of Chongqing. There are a whole bunch of big things happening. And there are some potential problems in traffic because cargo has been growing quite slowly. We have problems with financing, and I think we have a bubble of orders, and I'll show you very quickly some charts. So the first question, since we are getting into this season of how is this season different from other seasons, how is this cycle different from other cycles? We have low interest rates, which means there is money available and it wants to go someplace, and aircraft are sexy. We have some government help in financing of new aircraft. We have high oil prices, which make it more reasonable for airlines to desire new aircraft. Manufacturers need money to some degree because they screwed up and didn't produce all the planes that they were planning, and you know, that they need to keep Joe in the standard of living that he's used to. We also have declining military, or at least talk about declining military spending, and that will affect guys like Boeing, Airbus quite substantially. And definitely Airbus, Boeing want to slow new entrants. And they were very successful at it. In other words, if they sell a lot, there's less room for C-Series, the Chinese and Russian manufacturers to come in. And it's a good strategy that seemed to work. Finally, we had the new aircraft types, even if they're not purely new, but that always stimulates demand. And the final point, salesman on steroids, Lee is not retiring yet. So the fact that John didn't retire causes a bubble. You can, Airbus people, you can tell him that. Okay, if I could move over there, I would be showing this, but since that doesn't work, Joe, you mind pointing? Yeah, over there. Thank you. We have various times of over-ordering, and notice that in kind of the last 5-10 years, we had a lot of orders, we then stopped, and then we went back to it, like an addict. And same picture when you do narrow bodies and wide bodies. And I now look at narrow bodies and then wide bodies, backlog as percent of active fleet. And if you can see in the, as I'm pointing here, you can see, in the late 80s there was a bubble and it burst. We had a bubble and it started coming down and it didn't. And as I said, there are good reasons why the numbers are not coming down that I mentioned a few minutes ago. Wide bodies, similar story. Another way to look at it is backlog as a multiple of annual production. And in terms of narrow bodies, you know, if you want to buy new aircraft, you have to wait years for it. Now, to me, that's a sign of a bubble. And same even more for wide bodies. So I, Adam, believe that, yes, we're in a bubble environment with too many orders. I did some simple calculations, kind of back of the envelope, for narrow bodies. The first chart is for narrow bodies. Historical production for the last 20-something years has been growing at 2.9%. The announced production rate is 42. Airbus wants to achieve it this year. Boeing wants to achieve it in 2014. Both are talking, and by the way, the Airbus includes the engine in here. Both are talking about rates that will be about 60 aircraft a month. And the interesting thing is, when you look at Boeing Airbus forecasts, they do not clearly, the numbers that they are actually, I should say, they are included. Because it's for a whole, I'll show you Boeing Airbus forecast, and these numbers for these made a mistake. Forget the not. They are included. It's for the whole sector. So, if you look at it, the blue line historical is production levels, the red line is the trend. So if we continue the same trend, we would get to a certain level. But we already know that Boeing Airbus will go to 42 a month. So I included this in my analysis and then applied the same trend, and I got the line going up. Now, if present trend, so going back, the number on top there reaches 26,216 planes. The average forecast between Boeing and Airbus for the next 20 years of narrow-body aircraft is 21,000. So if Boeing Airbus continue growing at historical levels, they don't have to jack it up to 60. If they continue growing at historical levels, they'll produce about 5,000 planes too many. It may be even, bless you, it may be even more, because there are a few thousand C-Series 919s and MS-21s. And I took the numbers that Ed Greenslet produces. I think everybody knows Ed. This is the Wall Street guy who about 50 years ago retired and moved out of the US and lives in Florida and has been more busy than he ever was in his life and produces good numbers. Now, if you look at it here, if they sell as Ed says they will, we are already, the 42 is not justified already. This is for the next 20 years. I mean, the numbers to me look like there's a disconnect. So I think that the announced rates are not compatible with Airbus Boeing forecasts. I think that there's a possibility though. I mean, some people can say you may be wrong, and there's always a first time, so I may be wrong. And I'm not going to have a bet on it here. There's possibility of higher retirements and shorter economic life if oil prices stay very high for a very long time. And I will talk about it later. Wide body, historically 1% growth. In order to get to the forecast that Airbus and Boeing have, the growth rate will have to dramatically change. It will have to change to about 6%. I'm not saying it won't happen, but it's, you guys have your Airbus Boeing, and that's the only ones here. You have a lot to do to get it right. Okay, last year what I did say was, by the time the NEO 797 is delivered, oil prices will be below $40 per barrel. The reason I said 797 was that this was the all-new Boeing plane. At that time, Boeing was talking about it, and that was the official party line. So, of course, I couldn't say something that is not within the dogma. NEO was supposed to be, what, 15, 797, 21. So we are talking about 2018. And that's what I believe will happen, and I'll try to show you. Now, I do admit it's a wimpy forecast, and I'll try to explain why analysis doesn't always work with oil. By the way, when I was showing this, Brother Nico sent me a note saying that you mean 400 instead of 40. And I think that's very indicative of how we feel about oil prices. If you will say in the next number of years oil prices will be 40, people are not going to accept it. If you say 400, they will accept it. Why? Because in the short term there is a lot of volatility. Okay, simple economics. Everything that has a price is scarce. So if something becomes more scarce, price goes up. That the price mechanism affects it. If something is not scarce, it doesn't have a price.
A vast virus database has been updated.
On the other hand, there are competitive and non-competitive markets. In a competitive markets, things work out better than and are easier to predict in non-competitive markets. So illustration, there was a book written by Stanley Jevons in 1906, where he conclusively proved that we will run out of coal in the 1940s. And the reason was straightforward. He looked at demand growing and how much supply there is and figured out that, okay, we are running out of coal. What happened? Well, as there was scarcity of coal, its price went up, people used less, they found more, and they found an alternative source of energy. How much coal do you think we have today? Well, 118 years left, which is even longer than it will take me to retire. Are we running out of oil? Definitely not. Here's a chart going back to 56, that shows that the exhaustible resource of oil, there's actually more and more of it. We have now well over 50 years of that stuff left at today's levels of production, which is much more than we had in 56. So our price increase is the results of a demand push. In other words, the story that all Chinese are driving cars now and there's huge increase in demand. The answer is yes, Chinese are driving cars, but that's not the answer. And when you look at 2005 to 2011, oil price increased 77%. Yes, China's oil consumption increased 54% at that time. That's substantial. So you say, okay, that works. Why did the Chinese do it? Well, because the economy grew at 86%. What does it mean that the economy grew at 86%? It means that on average, every product, every raw material increased by 86%, except oil, which grew much less. World economy at the same time grew 15%. Total world oil demand went up only 0.5%. This is from 2005 to 2011, basically the level stayed stable. So whatever China increased, Europe and the US actually cut their consumption. Here's a chart that I recently saw produced by Airbus, and basically oil prices from 2000 to 2011 increased by close to 200%. Traffic went up 53%, jet fuel demand up only 3%. So yes, higher oil prices mean that we, the industry, are much better at handling it. In other words, price mechanism works. Historically, oil prices, increases in oil prices are the result of supply changes, not demand factors. Excuse me. So if you look here at Iran, Iraq, 76 over 8 million barrels a day. In 81, the Iran-Iraq war down to 2 million. Then in 91, when US invaded Iraq, again went down. Libya, with their upheaval, down over 1 million. Former USSR, no war, but the disintegration of the economy caused numbers to go from 11 to 6. Now they are back at 11. And Kuwait, again, when they were invaded. So you can see the dramatic changes that happen in supply, but not in demand. I know for John Vitale, who doesn't like numbers like all certified ISTAT appraisers, it's the same thing with charts. So John, this is for you. Excuse me. These are historical oil prices taken from BP. And if you go back, this is, time when I was in high school in the 1860s, early on, but when you start from about 1890, you can see that prices were very stable. By the way, this is in inflation-adjusted numbers. And you had one big jump, which caused a crash, and now we have a second, which kind of started coming down, but continued down. But these are, at least when you look at long-term historical values, these numbers were kind of out of line. And this was production from 65, and you can see that a very different pattern was happening. The growth rate from 65 to about 80 was very high, and since then, very low increases in production. And it's not that we don't have the oil. As I said, we have over 50 years of oil left. The reason is that there is less demand because of higher prices. So last time oil prices went very high in 79, 87. Let's look at this. The level that we had in 79 was not reached until 17 years later because of the initial high oil prices. During the same time, world GDP grew over 60%. And this is what you have here, and you can see that you had huge increase, but you had in non-OPEC production, you had increases in the 80s. And let's look at it from again, look at it here, and if you are OPEC in 83, this is what you will see. You say world demand at very high prices. You saw the huge spike that we had is coming down, non-OPEC coming up. If you continue these two, OPEC will be out of business. So what they did was Saudi Arabia increased production dramatically, prices fell. Basically, OPEC cut the production to less than half, and it was all achieved by Saudis, who cut their production from 10 million barrels a day to 3.5. How is today different? Well,